With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Well, good evening to you lads and lasses. Welcome to Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. I'm Caleb Colquitt, the host of Tactics here on News Radio 1440, and it's a pleasure to be with you this St. Patrick's Day. Now, I did contemplate doing the entire show in an Irish accent like that, but I felt that people might not take me all that seriously reading news with a fake Irish accent, but nonetheless, it's one of the accents that I consider one of my better ones, so I thought it might not be a bad idea to start that out. And I think we need a little lightheartedness, considering everything that is going on in the world. I appreciate the fact that we can have a little bit of fun with ourselves and enjoy, some of the entertainment value of this as well, because I don't want to be somebody that's downtrodden or talk about how the world is falling every day. There's a lot to look forward to, and still a lot of fun to have, even if you are, like me, quarantined in your own quarters. Some people might think that me being quarantined and locked up in here might have affected my thinking starting out the show like that, but nonetheless, we are going to go ahead and get into the serious news of the day, particularly what is going on with the coronavirus. As always, that is going to be the first order of business, what is going on in the state of Alabama in regards to the coronavirus. And as we have started yesterday keeping track of this, we're going to be doing this every single day, giving you a quick coronavirus update specifically for the state of Alabama. And here is the latest update from the Alabama Department of Public Health. You can go ahead and see the numbers there and what counties they come from. You may notice that we are actually up to 29 cases, which is 10 more than yesterday, which actually I would say is pretty good news, because all things considered, 10 more cases since yesterday, considering all the new testing that we've done, not really that bad. Now, I'm not saying that it's not going to get exponentially worse. I'm not saying that that curve is not going to hit a peak and skyrocket. I'm just saying for the time being, 10 new cases considering all the new tests that we've administered, that's really not that big a deal. It will probably become a big deal. But as of right now, I think that we should count our lucky stars, is all I'm saying. And to this day, of course, 0 deaths. The hospitals are still operating just fine. They're not, swelling or going over capacity. So as of right now, it looks as though we're holding steady, and hopefully with a lot of the measures that we're taking, people being a little bit more cautious to wash their hands, staying indoors, staying with their family, all the different big events being closed down, it looks like we are at least starting to have some effect at mitigating this. Hopefully that remains true. And speaking of all the extra testing that the state of Alabama is doing, we are doing so much testing, in fact, that the Birmingham testing facility had to be shut down completely. And that really is a shame, but it does speak to the fact that people are taking this seriously. There very well could be people that are not, or are taking it overly seriously or panicking, and I hope that's not the case. But at least what this thing does is that the testing facilities are at least operating, and they're getting so much business and so much response that they are having problems actually functioning, which granted is not great, but it's better than people just ignoring it and not getting tested. So that's the thing. So one thing that's really, really important to this and speaks to this is what we talked about yesterday, which is do not get tested unless you already have symptoms. I get it. You're curious, you want to see if you have the thing beforehand, and it would be great if everybody could get tested and it wouldn't overload the system, and you could just get tested, see if you have it, and if you do, even if you don't have symptoms yet, just not to stay around people and just kind of quarantine yourself, and if not, then you don't have to worry quite as much. You have to worry about getting it caught, you have to worry about catching it, but you don't have to worry about passing it on to other people. But this is not the kind of thing that you just get a test for just because you're curious and think you might have it. Unless you're symptomatic, you do not need to be getting tested right now. Now, maybe because we are in the state of Alabama, and this is something that has affected me, it's just that time of year. The pollen is getting everybody up in getting their allergies messed up and working them into a dander and causing them to have all kinds of things like a sore throat and sneezing, which also are symptoms of the coronavirus. Although with the coronavirus, it's much more about the respiratory system. It's much more about your lungs and your throat and coughing than it is sneezing. And so that's one thing to be cognizant of. But maybe that is a contributing factor that a lot of people that are having seasonal allergies that would normally be like this, regardless of whether or not COVID-19 was in the state or not, are thinking that they do have symptoms of this thing, which is why it's important, again, unless you have symptoms and have a good reason for thinking you might have COVID-19, do not get tested because you're overloading the testing facilities. Only go if you have a really good reason to believe that you have this thing. And that includes things like a fever. That includes a very sore throat, a severe cough. And the big tell is shortness of breath. Because shortness of breath is not something that is associated with a cold. Normally, fever isn't either, but in rare cases it can be. But especially if you have shortness of breath, that's the big tell that you probably need to go ahead and get tested. So that's really what we're dealing with right now, and it was hit so hard that the testing site at Church of the Highlands up on Highway 280 got shut down, and it said, according to the report, that police officers were doing their best to try to keep the facility open and redirect traffic. But the traffic on Highway 280 there in Montgomery was so bad they had to shut the entire facility down because it was halting all traffic on 280. To which I responded, well, how would you know that that's any different than a normal day on 280? Because it does seem like that. If you've ever been through 280 during rush hour in Birmingham, I mean, everything's standing still anyway. Back when I was getting some of my tests and some of my treatments in relation to my cancer, I had to do that a few times and go to UAB, and oh my gosh, that thing was just an absolute nightmare. But nonetheless, that's what's going on right now, and the fact that this thing was shut down, I think it's really interesting that it was at a church. And now, I have my misgivings spiritually and doctrinally with the Church of the Highlands. I'm not going to get into it right now because that's not really the purpose. I've actually talked about that on the show before. But for right now, suffice it to say, I have some issues with them. But I do think it's quite ironic that a church building was the place that they were doing the testing, and they were so flooded and so backed up that it stopped traffic on 280. And I just got to thinking, man, what if people were so concerned with their spiritual health and spiritual well-being as much as they are with their physical health and well-being, with being afraid that they have the COVID-19 virus? What if they had that level of concern for their spiritual well-being and their relationship with Christ, that that's what happened every Sunday? That people were so chomping at the bit to get into the door of a church that we had traffic jams and people having to control the traffic and still failing because there is such a burning, passionate desire to find out if your spiritual health is good, as opposed to what we're seeing now with people more concerned with their physical health. I'm not saying physical health is not important. I'm not saying that having a zeal and a passion for that is not also something that is a good thing. I'm just saying that I think our priorities as a society are screwed up, and this is a pretty glowing testament to that. And I say this as somebody in Alabama, in the Bible Belt, where people do tend to attend worship services on Sunday on a pretty regular basis. Nonetheless, if people trying to get into a church like this just completely overwhelms the system to a degree that it cannot be held up, it has to actually be stopped because of that, I think that speaks to the kind of passion and zeal that we ought to have for our spiritual well-being every day, not just in emergencies. And I really wish that that's the kind of society that we were. Now, with all of this, there have been an awful lot of states that have taken different measures and have actually, interestingly enough, called upon other states to take similar measures. In Alabama, it's not as big because we didn't have a confirmed case of COVID-19 until just a few days ago. And it's really blowing up in cities that have big ports like New York, Boston, and even some places on the West Coast where they have a lot of the more prominent airports, that kind of thing, more ports of entry. And so because of that, what we are seeing now and what we're looking at is some of these states taking extreme measures and encouraging other states to do the same. So I did want to real quick just give a list of things that the state could do and that the state is actually being encouraged to do, but Alabama so far yet has not done and should not do. First of all, this was an interesting one. I believe it was the governor of Illinois that instated this one, a restriction on the sale of alcohol. Now, I am not what you would call a proponent of alcohol. In fact, I've never had a drop of alcohol in my entire life. Not once. And so this is not coming from the place of somebody that, oh, they've got to have their alcohol. No, that's not who I am. It doesn't affect me in any way if all sales of all alcohol in the entire United States, if it were made illegal, if we made another constitutional amendment that outlawed alcohol, I'm sure it would affect me in an indirect way, but in a direct way, it wouldn't affect me at all. And so the reason that I am saying that is just so you know, this is not coming from the standpoint of somebody that really thinks this is a bad idea because I really want my alcohol. I just don't understand how this helps. I mean, people drinking less alcohol, I tend to think of that as a good thing, but I don't understand how that helps us with the coronavirus. I mean, if anything, the only thing that I can think of that might affect it would be in a negative way, because you might have people that are buying alcohol like Everclear, for example, to kill germs around their house because they can't find disinfectant. Now, that seems kind of extreme to me because Everclear is super expensive. But again, I don't really comprehend why on earth you would intentionally do that. I don't get how restricting the sale of alcohol helps. Another interesting one, restricting the sale of gasoline. Again, this is kind of along the same lines as alcohol. Why? What good does that do? If anything, it cripples people that may be, going to take care of somebody that's sick or trying to help somebody out. I don't get how restricting the purchasing of gasoline would have anything to do with it. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, granted, it would probably affect us less than normally because so many people are staying home or just going straight to work and then coming straight back and not going anywhere. Otherwise, it would probably have less of an impact just because people aren't driving as much, but I don't see how restricting the sale of it helps us in any way. Another one, enacting mandatory curfews. Now, this is true across the board, so I'm going to talk about this broadly first and then narrow in as how it relates specifically to the coronavirus. As a general rule, and I've said this on my program, and actually I've said this on Kevin's program too, curfews are a useless tool that politicians tend to put forward to make it seem as though they are doing something productive when in reality they are not. Normally that's what happens. This is has been study after study after study done that curfews to try to do things like curtail crime, they don't help and never have. Every study that has been done in cities, and these are cities that they were also using control cities that did not have a curfew of similar size, of similar demographics to compare them, there has not been a single study ever conducted, not once, that showed a curfew was helpful in curtailing crime. Now I'm going to get very narrow and speak specifically to this. The same principle applies. I know that preventing crime is not the issue, preventing gathering is the issue, but either way, this is yet another example of politicians trying to make you think that they are doing something useful, and so they take an extreme measure to say, hey, I'm doing something. Now, does doing that thing actually make it better or improve the situation? Well, no, not really, but I'm doing something. And that tends to be the MO when it comes to politicians trying to enact curfews. And this is no different because here's the thing. If you were going to restrict a person from moving around after a certain time of night, what does that mean? That means that they have less total hours to move around. I mean, that just stands to reason. What if the reason that they're moving around late is specifically because they're trying to avoid human contact, because they're concerned about contracting the coronavirus? See, the problem with the curfew is for things that people have to do, let's say for shopping at a grocery store, they would rather go at like 1 a.m. when there's going to be virtually nobody around because they got to go grocery shopping, but they don't want to do it when there's a lot of people, so they wait until really late at night to be able to go. You see, by enacting these curfews to say, no, they have to do it before 8 o'clock, then you have less ability to spread out the times in which you would do that, which means you're more likely to come in contact with people that have the virus, thus spreading the virus faster. So with the other two things, alcohol and gasoline, I don't really understand how they help prevent the spread of COVID-19, but with this one, with mandatory curfews, it actually makes the problem worse. Great example, Sunday night. I had to go do something, and I waited until pretty late at night so that I could go when I was sure that there was going to be nobody around. I was moving something out of my dad's old house. I knew that the couple that was moving in there, who were my cousins, would probably not be there so late, and so I specifically waited until late at night to be able to go and pick some things up that I needed to, and that was to protect me and to protect them. But I wouldn't have had that option if there had been a mandatory curfew. Even though I was going from one empty house to another empty house and doing so specifically so I would not come in contact with another human being, my action would have then been deemed illegal. And that's just one small anecdotal example, but on the whole, this is the problem, that all a curfew does is compress the time that you're able to be out, thus meaning that people are going to be more likely to run into other people and increase their rate of human contact, and thus increase the speed at which the virus spreads. This is one of the dumbest ideas you could have possibly come up with because it makes the problem worse. Another one, restrict the sale of guns and ammo. This is another one that doesn't necessarily make the problem better or worse, but it doesn't make any sense, and especially at a time where you're supposed to be quarantined and basically holed up with your family. I mean, I really don't think it's going to come to this, and I hope it doesn't come to this. But if we have to stay on our own for a few days, and if the supply chain gets adequately interrupted, in other words, the store shelves start getting scarce, you may have people trying to loot, which means that a firearm and ammo would come in really handy. Now, this isn't really so much something that would affect me, because, I mean, I'm not trying to brag or anything, but I have enough ammo to last me for a while. And that's because I've been preparing for this ahead of time. What this would really affect are people that are not like me, that just happen to have a gun, let's say, passed down for their grandfather. They haven't been prepping, they're not really hunters, they don't really have any ammo in the house, but they do happen to have a gun. They may need to go out and just, buy a box or two of ammo just in case something horrible happens. God forbid that would happen or that they have to use it, but just in case something like that does take place. Well, if you've restricted ammo, you have now robbed that person of being able to do so, or maybe somebody that never thought about having a gun before, but decided now, okay, things are, they might be wanting to hit the fan. I'll go out and buy a cheap firearm just for home defense and a few rounds of ammo. Well, now that person can't do that. This is a monumentally stupid idea. And if a person has enough money to purchase a firearm, they probably already have provisions for themselves. I'm not saying that in every single circumstance, but there's a very good chance that if somebody is doing that, they already have provisions for themselves. So the idea that people who would be looting would go out and buy firearms to be able to procure the things that they need, that's very, very unlikely. They might be willing to do so in black market style, but this restriction wouldn't affect that anyway. And they're not going to be the people going to Academy or Bass Pro to purchase a firearm. And so all you're doing here, just like most restrictions on purchasing firearms, is restricting the ability of the average, normal, law-abiding citizen to protect themselves and their family. Again, this is a really stupid idea. And another one that was really odd is mandating the closure of businesses to a certain time. Now, some were saying that they'll be closed after a certain period, and some were saying that businesses that act as gathering places, for example, restaurants, they're just going to close down completely and they're going to mandate that businesses close. Well, first of all, there's obviously a little bit of a issue here with whether or not the state even has the power to do that. But secondly, and I think that this one may be more important, this one would primarily hurt employees, not business owners. Because even though, yes, this is going to have an economic impact on business owners, let's say, for example, you run a restaurant. You're a business owner. Well, if you run a restaurant, you probably have a decent amount of income. You'll probably be able to weather being able to do all of this for a while. You've probably got, a number of resources at your disposal. And if you have to keep your doors open, or you want to keep your doors open and want to keep the business running, you're going to take an economic hit anyway, because people are being advised to, and I think that this is good advice, not go to restaurants or public places where you'll be around strangers very often. And so if this happens, you're probably taking an economic hit if your business is mandatorily closed, probably not as much, but you're still taking a significant hit if that happens. So here's the irony. The business owner is going to be in pretty much the same boat either way. They're going to have a couple rough months, but at the same time, they have a lot of resources available to them personally. What happens to the employees? Well, if they're hourly pay, which most small businesses have hourly paid employees, they got nothing. At least if the doors were open, the employees would have to continue to be paid while the business is open. And so primarily, it's ironic that this is being proposed by people that are saying they're wanting to help working people. It actually would wind up hurting them more. And it would primarily affect the employees that are wage earners as opposed to the investors and the business owners. And so again, this is another government regulation that I understand the intent, and this one actually I could see an argument for it somewhat slowing down the spread of COVID-19. I do at least see that there is some merit to that one, but at the same time, the reason that I say that government shouldn't be making these decisions is because, for all we know, it actually could wind up primarily hurting low-wage earners, restaurant workers, those kinds of people, when they need money the most. And that seems to be a really bad idea. But ultimately what this goes down to is that decisions that are made in haste are usually the wrong ones. Not always, but typically if you make a decision out of fear or paranoia or panic, or because you're doing so because you feel like you have to go ahead and do something right now. Not always, but usually those decisions are bad decisions. And that's part of the reason our government was specifically designed in such a way that it is slow and methodical, and you have to go through a lot of steps, and you have to get a lot of people to agree before the government takes any action. I get that that can be a pain, especially in an emergency situation like we're all in right now. But the reason that that is there is to keep us from making some of these boneheaded decisions that I just pointed out that actually make the problem worse rather than better. Taking no action is preferable to taking an action that winds up making the problem worse than it already is. And so let's all take a second, take a breath, really think about the implications of these policies before we just automatically support them because, hey, well, at least they're doing something. Well, no, that something needs to be a good thing rather than just something. And we need to weigh the pros and cons of that. Now, moving off of local politics here for a second and talking about something on a national level, I want to give kudos to President Trump for something. And goodness knows that, especially on issues of religion, he and I have not always seen eye to eye. But I want to give him kudos for calling for a National Day of Prayer. And I am frankly quite astounded at the fact because I had full intentions of doing a segment on this yesterday. And then I looked back at the show and realized I had not mentioned it. So President Trump called for a National Day of Prayer. And that was actually on Sunday, March the 15th. So many of you may not have even realized that. If not, I do encourage you to make today or tomorrow a day of prayer and join in and pray for the country and pray for our health and also pray for our economic security and pray for God's intervention and His will to be done. I mean, there's a myriad of other things you could pray for, and the fact that we are calling for a national day of prayer is significant because it is essentially the president saying, look, we need help, we need God's help specifically, and because of that, I'm asking all of you to pray for our nation. And President Trump did this very well. He handled it the right way. And this is something that used to be sort of the norm for presidents to do, that occasionally when there was some kind of big event coming up, something where the nation would need prayers, that what the president would do is ask for the citizens to pray, sometimes even to fast. That was not uncommon either. And this isn't something that was way off in the distant past. The truth is that when it came to presidents like George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, H.W. Bush, Reagan, these things were not unprecedented or uncommon. In fact, the way that we got Thanksgiving, did you know, you probably have if you've seen any of my Thanksgiving Day specials, but did you know that Thanksgiving used to be, its original name was a national day of prayer and thanksgiving. And if you look at the original Thanksgiving Day proclamations, it didn't have anything to do with turkey or anything. It specifically asked citizens to pray, to be thankful for the blessings that we have been given. In fact, the way that Thanksgiving became an annual national holiday was because of President Lincoln, who specifically asked for people to pray in thanks of God's blessing and also for success in the war. Of course, that was in the middle of the Civil War. And so this is a thing that is not uncommon for presidents to do if you're looking at the whole of American history. The only president really, and I'm not saying that every single other president actually called for national days of prayer, but the only president that seemed hostile towards that and sort of broke that precedent was Barack Obama. It's really interesting that that was something that was a tradition, it was a norm for a really long time until Barack Obama came in. And as I've said 1,000 times, a lot of people have said, well, no, he's a Muslim. I don't think he's a Muslim. I don't believe that for a second. I think he is a very devoted secularist. And one thing that a secularist would never do is ask for people to pray for the country because they wouldn't believe that it would actually accomplish or do anything. As much as I have misgivings on Trump, and believe me, I do not think that the guy is a moral example, but I think that this was a good thing. And I do appreciate, if nothing else, that President Trump restored this tradition, that he made it okay again for presidents to call for a national day of prayer. And that's something that I think is wholly appropriate. I do like the fact that President Trump has done this. I mean, yeah, do I wish it could have come from a better messenger? Obviously I do. But he's the president now, and so at least at this moment, he's the only one that can restore this tradition. And so I'm glad that he decided to do so. And I appreciate that the president is not hesitant to call on citizens to pray, and treats faith as though it is meaningful, and treats prayer as though it means something and will accomplish something. That's something that you did not see from President Obama. I mean, even if he wasn't openly hostile to praying, you could tell that he and his flunkies on the left treated it as though that prayer was something that was to be reviled. That when people said that they were praying for something, that they actually disliked that. You can tell that, for example, in response to all the mass shootings. The people on the left were saying, no, we don't even want your prayers. And this happened under Barack Obama's watch. I'm not saying that he was the one directing it. I'm not suggesting that at all. I don't want to overstate what I'm saying here. But what I am saying is there was a hostility from the White House that you could see when it came to people of faith and people of prayer. He famously remarked at one point that, these people, they bitterly cling to their God and their guns. I mean, if that's not a commentary on how Barack Obama felt about prayer, I don't know what is. So when it comes to President Trump, I appreciate that he does not hesitate to ask for the blessings of heaven and ask for the citizens to do the same when talking to God. And I think that whether President Trump realizes this or not, I don't know. But ultimately, it doesn't matter how good our response to the virus is. It doesn't matter how much we socially distance ourselves. It doesn't matter if every single person followed every single guideline that came out from the CDC and we handled it exactly the right way. Everything was done without a hitch. If we don't have God's blessing, then none of that matters. If we do not have God's help, then it doesn't matter how good our response is from a worldly standpoint. We are going to fail. I mean, as Benjamin Franklin said when they were putting together the Constitution, he says, unless they build it upon the name of the Lord, they build in vain. And ultimately, if we as a country lose that as our central pillar, the whole foundation is going to fall because that's what we're founded upon. And so if we get that wrong, it doesn't matter how good our response is. Ultimately, God's judgment is going to catch up with us. But not everybody was happy, as you can imagine, with this call to prayer. And I kind of alluded to this a second ago when you saw so many people on the left actually making fun of and belittling people praying for a situation and saying that their prayers were neither wanted nor needed. And continuing in this tradition, David Hogg, you remember the kid from Parkland that was really big for about 2 months during the gun debate that ensued after Parkland and then kind of fell off the map. He actually tweeted out about this the other day. And there is an expletive, but I've censored part of it out. You can tell which word he's using, but you can't see the whole word, so fair warning there. This is David Hogg saying, "Don't let this administration address COVID-19 like our national gun violence epidemic. F a national day of prayer. We need immediate comprehensive action." Again, this is a display of people that are hostile towards prayer, that don't believe that it does any good, that when people pray for something, they believe that that's actually an excuse for inaction, and they don't want to hear it. They are actually offended by the fact that people of faith think that prayer isn't an appropriate response to something. And what's really sad, because David Hogg, I mean, the guy is well known, I guess, in certain political circles. The average American has no idea who he is. But him tweeting out something like that is repugnant, but at the end of the day, he's just a random citizen. What really bothered people about this, and I understand this, is Rashida Tlaib, a duly elected representative in the House of Representatives and member of the squad, along with AOC and the other two chicks, Ilhan Omar, and then the other one who nobody can ever remember her name. The fourth Beatle, as it were. Rashida Tlaib actually tweeted this out the other day, and I don't understand this mentality at all. Because when it comes to this, I don't get the idea that people are offended by prayer. Because I have never been offended by prayer or mentions of goodwill by anybody. Now, granted, I've never had a Muslim say that they would be praying for me, but if they did, it wouldn't bother me. I mean, I don't think that the prayer is doing any good, to be perfectly honest, but I'm not going to lash out at them and say, no, I don't want your prayers. Well, that's not something a rational, normal person does. They are trying to extend a measure of goodwill. I don't think that the goodwill is necessarily going to be beneficial in a concrete way, but I appreciate the fact that they, at the very least, want to pray for me. When a Jewish person prays, now they are following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I believe the fact that they are not praying in the name of Jesus would also mean that their prayers are not, sufficient. But I'm not going to say to the person that I don't want them to pray for me or that I don't appreciate the gesture. I mean, that's just something that a nasty, wicked person would do. There are all kinds of people that wish me, goodwill that I don't necessarily agree with politically. But that doesn't mean that I want to throw it back in their face. I mean, that's not something that would be very Christian for someone to do. Rashida Tlaib, of course, saw this and retweeted it, apparently agreed with the message, which is the reason that she retweeted it without comment. And then when people saw it, started backtracking on it, and this was her response to it, which we'll look at right now. So Representative Tlaib says, "Let me be clear, as someone who has been praying through all, and as someone who attended the National Prayer Breakfast, my retreat was not to be an attack on prayer. It was to bring attention to the need for meaningful action to combat this public health crisis." Now, Rashida Tlaib is one of the most vulgar people you will ever run into. She has no qualities whatsoever that are ladylike at all. And just recently she was talking about, well, maybe what you should do is not want to have sex with me, which I can get on board with. I agree with that. Nobody should ever want to have sex with Rashida Tlaib, and that's something people on the right and left should agree on. But at the same time, she's also been known to just talk about vulgar subjects like that over and over again. She famously said to her young son, which was also incredibly disturbing, that in regards to Donald Trump, right after she was elected, that we're going to impeach the MFer. And so she's just a very crass, vicious, nasty person. And I don't see how David Hogg's tweet that says, "F your National Day of Prayer," is in any way not an attack on prayer. If you wanted actions to take place, if you, in other words, said, okay, the National Prayer Day, but that's not enough, we would like other things, then say that. There's no reason to be vulgar and go after people praying for the country. There was no reason for her to retweet that unless it was an attack on prayer. There's no way that you can sort of backpedal on this, Rashida Tlaib. You have already been caught, and when it comes to being an attack on prayer, I don't see how you can interpret that tweet any other way. If you said, okay, let's have the National Day of Prayer, and I also want these things to happen, I may disagree with the things you want to happen, but at least it's not being vitriolic towards somebody praying. This absolutely was in the most vulgar possible way. To put this into perspective, what if Donald Trump had said, or let's not even go with said, let's try to make it as much of a one-to-one comparison as possible. Let's just say that President Trump retweeted somebody that said, "F the Muslims, also we need the travel ban." And then people got outraged by this and said President Trump didn't need to do that. And then he comes out later and says, "Oh, well, what I meant was, I'm just saying we need a travel ban. It wasn't an attack on Muslims." Do you really think that the left is going to give him a pass on that? What if the same thing happened with Mexicans? Let's say Trump retweeted somebody that said, "F the Mexicans, also we need a wall." Do you think Donald Trump would be able to come back and say, "I was just voicing my support for needing the wall"? I don't think the liberals would be very understanding of that. And I find it hilarious that they don't see the hypocrisy there. Because if that had happened, they would have automatically said, "Oh, well, that's clearly an attack on Mexicans. That's clearly an attack on Muslims." They wouldn't say that, "Oh, well, he was just trying to show his support for the policy that was being espoused elsewhere in the tweet." No, that didn't fly with Donald Trump. It shouldn't fly with Donald Trump. If he had retweeted that, I would have been critical of him. Just like I'm being critical of Rashida Tlaib for retweeting something like this. And ultimately, though it does sadden me to see such vulgarity in our elected leaders, I am grateful for the fact that they're showing their true colors. This is the kind of person that Rashida Tlaib is. And that should be a reminder to us of, unfortunately, who is in charge in the country. This is a person that has actual power in America, and they can allow this vulgarity and an attack on prayer to proceed from them, and then try to backpack and pretend like it's okay. That's just not going to fly. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a minute on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Today we actually have two readings from the SJW Bible dealing with the origins of life. The first one comes from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verses 4 through 8. And it reads, Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. Though to be clear, that does not mean that you were a person before birth. At that point, you were merely a clump of cells that I didn't care about. Then I said, Alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak because I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am a youth. Just speak from the heart, saying whatever you feel in the moment. And don't let anyone tell you you're wrong. Your youth is great because anyone over 30 is backward and out of touch anyway, and probably supports the patriarchy. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you from the bigoted old white men, declares the Lord. Our second reading of the day will come from Psalm 139, 13 through 16. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb, even though I was not human until birth. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made through billions of years of theistic evolution. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you, when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth with my fish ancestors. Your eyes have seen my unformed gender-neutral substance, and in your iPad were written all the days that were ordained for me, that I might become an actual person when born, so that I could fulfill my goal of protesting fossil fuels. But if my gender-neutral parental unit had decided to exercise her right to end her pregnancy to stop that, I totally respect it. Wow, so inspirational. This has been another reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on St. Patrick's Day. Don't freak out, it's just water. But I do like the mug. Man, actually, I was talking about Clearly Canadian the other day, and I had a little Korean candy that I was talking about hoarding. These were the things that I was hoarding for the forthcoming apocalypse. And then today I have a St. Patrick's Day background with a German-style beer stein that I purchased in the Ukraine. It's like the freaking UN in here. Whoever said Caleb isn't multicultural just didn't know what they were talking about. So I thought, because again, I'm trying to keep everybody's spirits up and talk about some fun things along with some of the serious news regarding the virus. It'd be an interesting thought experiment to ask, what are you watching? If you are self-quarantined like I am, you're probably stuck without a whole lot to do. What are you watching? And, you know, whether it's streaming services, whether you've got it on DVD or Blu-ray, what are you doing to keep yourself entertained? So there's a few things that I was watching, and I was going to recommend them in case anybody is wondering. Right now, I just recently got a Funimation account, which is an anime company. For those of you that don't know, I'm really big into anime. I love anime. I'm not sure exactly why, I just always have. I guess it's because there's so many anime that have a fantasy aspect, and I've always been sort of a fantasy guy. I write fantasy. My favorite books are the Chronicles of Narnia series. I love Lord of the Rings, that sort of thing. So because of that, I've always kind of gravitated towards that. I like swords and dragons and magic and that sort of thing. And speaking of that, and something that really falls into that genre, the one that I've been watching recently on Funimation is Fairy Tail. Now, animes are great for binge watching because they have like 3,000 episodes apiece. And so you could just keep watching basically in perpetuity. I think last time I checked, Naruto had, 800 episodes? So if you want to watch Naruto, I mean, you could be quarantined for a couple of years and not run out of episodes of Naruto. So I would really recommend that. And there's several streaming services that you can actually get for free on Funimation, for example, the one that I've been watching. That's the one that I use. You can actually watch a lot of their shows for no charge. I have a premium account that lets me watch a few extra things, but they have English and Japanese content, so you can watch it in the original Japanese if you're just weird and want to do that. You can watch the English dubs. I highly recommend Fairy Tail. I've really enjoyed it. And so that would be one thing you could watch. Another thing you could do is movie marathon. Now, you could do this over a streaming service, I guess, if you have this particular one, or you could just do it through Blu-ray, which is typically the way that I do it, because I'm old-fashioned. And it seems weird to say that Blu-ray is old-fashioned, but it kind of is now. So, a couple movies that are prime for movie marathons: Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That's, of course, a big one, because you could watch those you could spend a whole day just watching Lord of the Rings or just watching the Hobbit trilogy. And so those are ones that I recommend. In fact, I'm probably at some point this week going to just binge watch through all of The Hobbit and all of Lord of the Rings. Some of my favorite movies of all time. Another one that's kind of similar, doesn't take nearly as long to marathon through, is the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, each one of those is only about 2 hours, so that's like 6 hours of content between the three movies, and unfortunately the series isn't complete, so Disney only made 3 movies with Walden Media before they wound up sort of dropping the franchise, which is a darn shame, but it is still something that would be fun to watch. Star Wars is always a big one, and especially with so many new Star Wars movies out now and people that have Disney Plus, boy, you could really binge watch some Star Wars. You could watch the Rebels series, the Clone Wars series, which just recently had a 7th brand new season. New episodes of the Clone Wars are actually on Disney Plus right now. I've been keeping up with them and watching them. So far, the new episodes have been a little lackluster, but not terrible. And so I am looking forward to more content on that. And you could just watch the Star Wars movies. Now, there is a hotly contested debate on what order you should watch them in. I tend to go ahead and do a 1 through 6 marathon, just because then the movies get progressively better as the marathon goes on. But you could also do it the traditional way, watch them in the order that they came out. And then, of course, there's the new Star Wars movies, which, granted, Last Jedi's, not much. But the other two, pretty good, still entertaining. And Rise of Skywalker, like I said when it came out, it's definitely the best of that trilogy. So that recently came out. That's something to look forward to. I don't believe that one is actually on Disney Plus yet. So if you just have Disney Plus, you may be waiting for a while on that one. The Harry Potter series, 8 movies, really good. You could watch on those for 2 or 3 days. ABC Family, or I guess Freeform now, they seem to have a Harry Potter marathon every weekend. So you could also just wait for that. But the Harry Potter movies, a great idea to binge watch those. Really good films. And then this is probably my personal favorite, other than Lord of the Rings. I can't watch Lord of the Rings, because if I watch Lord of the Rings, I want to watch all of them. And it's harder to drop in and out of those because it's one long, continuous, unbroken story. This one's a little bit easier to break up if you want to still movie marathon, but not consistently throughout an entire day. Do the Marvel movies. You can look up a guide online as to what order to watch them in. Again, that's something where it's kind of debatable what is the best order to watch them in. You could watch them chronologically. You could watch them in the order that they came out. But the Marvel movies, the MCU universe ones at least, excellent films. You could also do the X-Men movies, I guess. Those would also be good. Some are definitely better than others. But with the Marvel MCU, you're going to get quality movies all the way throughout. Some are better than others still, but they're all pretty good. And so that would be my recommendation. If you've got kids, I think this would be a really cool thing to do. Now, I don't have kids, so take this with a grain of salt. But I think it would be really cool for kids to just sort of marathon some Disney classics, because since you've got a lot of time at home, you got parents and kids together in a lot of circumstances, I think it'd be really cool to just go ahead and introduce your kids to some classic Disney. Maybe the old Robin Hood, the one where the characters are all anthropomorphic foxes. I'm not sure why they are exactly, but that's the direction Disney decided to go with. Or a very, very underrated Disney movie, Sword in the Stone. Sword in the Stone, one of my all-time favorites. I think that it doesn't get nearly enough love from the Disney fan base, so introducing your kids to some of the newer Disney movies, some of the older Disney movies, some of the classics that you grew up with, that might be really cool, because they probably aren't as familiar with a lot of those. And, of course, the most important thing that you can watch, Tactics, right here on News Radio 1440's Facebook page, YouTube, Mixer, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, all of the venues. it's really important that you watch this show. I mean, I love Lord of the Rings and Marvel Universe and, Fairy Tale and all the other things I've talked about. You definitely need to watch Tactics because that also keeps you up to date on the latest news for what's going on here in the state of Alabama. So don't forget to watch us as well. Now, I wanted to go ahead and it looks like, yeah, we've got time to do this. I'm going to do a segment, and it's been a while since I've done one of these, but I think that you'll enjoy this. It's time for another rendition of Breaking the Internet.
Where'd you hear that?
The internet.
And you believed it?
Yeah. They can't put anything on the internet that isn't true.
Where'd you hear that? The internet.
Oh, look. Here comes my date. I met him on the internet. He's a French model.
Bonjour.
All right, and today's episode of Breaking the Internet. Typically, when memes go around, people share them without really thinking about them. This is sort of a common thing, and this particular meme is really no different because it does not stand up to even the slightest amount of intellectual scrutiny. So here we go, and I know that this is just, it's gone viral. That doesn't mean that it's right, and always keep that in mind with anything that we're doing with Breaking the Internet. So this was one that was being circulated earlier on Facebook. So you'll see the pictures there in the bottom. It's stores after the COVID-19 virus, and people have started to clear them out. And the commentary here is, late-stage capitalism, put under even the slightest stress, looks exactly like what capitalism claim socialism looks like. All right, so there's a couple of things right off the bat that I want to bring up about this one. First of all, 3 things are factually incorrect because there's a few other things that are incorrect. The spirit of the meme is headed in the wrong direction, but there's 3 things in that very short meme that are factually incorrect. Number 1, you see, the idea that there is such a thing as late-stage capitalism is an idea that springs forth from people that are already convinced that socialism is the correct path. They believe that socialism is a progression after capitalism. That was an idea that was espoused by Karl Marx. Now, the reason that that is untrue is because capitalism does not have stages. It is an economic policy. So the late-stage capitalism idea is a made-up term that can't even be properly defined, and considering the fact that only one country has even had something pretty darn close to capitalism for a while, even though we don't really have as much of it now as we did at one time, is America, there would be no observable way to compare it to other capitalist countries because there really aren't any others that are even close to as market-driven as the United States, and so that would be a term that is impossible to define, kind of like assault weapon. And what liberals usually mean by that when they say late-stage capitalism, what they mean by that is crony capitalism. What they mean by that is a capitalism that has become something where government is delving out things like bailouts and money and favoritism and favorable regulations to corporations, and corporations are in turn helping write laws and determine what laws are going to be. But that is not capitalism. Again, capitalism is an economic idea, an economic philosophy, not necessarily a political one. The two are connected, but they are not the same thing. And second of all, by definition, crony capitalism would not be capitalism. Because the very fact that you would have government intervening and trying to pick winners and losers and trying to bolster some companies or harm some other companies, that by definition is not capitalism. That is cronyism, which is a completely different thing. And the mere existence of that makes the system that we have right now not a free market. There are other things we are doing that are also not free market. But the presence of that alone would disqualify what you're talking about as being any kind of capitalism. Now, the second thing that they get wrong in this, in its purest form, a free market would have increased demand for the products that they're talking about, toilet tissue, that kind of thing. And then there would have been a price increase. What would have happened once the prices increased? Well, once that price increased, less people would be buying it in large quantities, which would have balanced out the demand curve. So in other words, the irony in all of this is that those store shelves were bare because there was a lack of capitalism. Because once that demand shot up, what should have happened by the retailer is they said, oh, looks like people are buying an awful lot of this stuff. We might be able to make some money if we increase the prices on it. So if you had a 48 pack of toilet paper that cost $90, I mean, as ridiculous as that sounds, if they had seen that on the store shelves, people would have at best bought one. I don't even know if they would have paid that much for it, maybe closer to $50. But anyway, it's just an imaginary number I'm using to make my point. I'm not using a real number here on the demand curve. But if that had happened, all of a sudden your demand would have dropped because prices would have increased. And so because of that, and the same thing happens with essentials when it comes to a natural disaster or whatever, people freak out and say, oh, you're price gouging. But if that price goes up, which is what capitalism would suggest should happen, then people wouldn't be hoarding, and you would see a much lower rate of demand. That's what you would have seen happen. And so the irony is the scenario that they're talking about that is the result of capitalism actually happened because there was not enough capitalism and the rules for a free market were not adhered to. And then finally, the third thing that they get wrong is they said under just the slightest stress. Well, by anybody's rubric or measure, this is not slight stress. This is extreme stress. Something like this, the closest thing that we have to even compare this to is an outbreak of Spanish influenza, which has been about 100 years ago. More than 100 years ago, actually. And so the idea that this is the slightest stress or this is something that happens all the time is simply not true. This is major stress. This is intense stress. Which, by the way, plays along to a part that I'm going to talk about where they're wrong in the spirit of what they're saying. But just on a factual basis, you could not make the case that what is happening right now in this country or around the world is a slight stress. This thing is an extreme, rare circumstance. Now, more importantly in all of this, it mostly comes from a worldview of somebody that already thinks the government is going to solve their problems. This is where they're wrong in the spirit of what they're talking about. We've already talked about how they're factually incorrect. This is where they go wrong in the understanding the overall worldview of where they're coming from, because the thing is, capitalism never claims to solve every single one of the world's problems. Capitalism does not make you immune to things like an act of God. It does not make you immune to pandemics or natural disasters, any of those things. It never claims to do that. All it does is say that it allocates resources the most efficient way possible. Now, sometimes the most efficient way possible is not great, but it's the best that you can do considering the circumstances there. See, that's the difference in socialism and capitalism. Socialism claims to account for those things and make a system that is perfect and never has any problems regardless of what's going on in the world. Capitalism doesn't. Capitalism never claims that. And so when you're dealing with something that absolutely cleans out store shelves, that happens, maybe once every 4 to 10 years? I mean, 4 years is being extremely generous and saying this is something that is an incredibly rare event, but we do have shortages of things occasionally for things like a hurricane coming up. I remember I couldn't get distilled water for a couple of weeks when one of the hurricanes hit down in Florida, and that was fine. Those people needed it more than I did, and that was okay. But my point in all that is, which by the way is another example of resources being allocated correctly to where they were most needed. But anyway, what I'm saying that is, this is somebody that doesn't understand because you're having a real problem within the quasi-capitalist system that we have now. This happening maybe once every 4, 7, 10 years. But under socialism, that's what it looks like all the time. That's the difference. Under capitalism, we restock. Under socialism, the shelves just stay bare constantly. There's a reason people in Venezuela are literally hunting down dogs in the streets just to be able to cook them to have something to eat. And the reason that the average person has lost over 30 pounds there. See, that's the difference here. is in capitalism, this is a temporary event that is caused by unforeseen circumstances that the market will eventually absorb and correct. In socialism, that never happens. They stay at a constant rate where commodities are not available to people, and that's the big difference. You see, socialism's goal, and its stated goal, is to install this kind of permanent utopia, whereas capitalism just adjusts to new problems. That's the big difference in socialism and capitalism, is that socialism never adjusts to correct anything, and every adjustment that must be made has to be made by bureaucrats at the top, and that response tends to be significantly slower than if people just vote with their dollars and correct mistakes or correct problems that occur because of different situations on their own. It's kind of like, if you were to put it into an analogy, capitalism is like an off-road vehicle, and socialism is like a sedan. Now, it may be a sedan that doesn't work about 80% of the time because it's constantly breaking down. We see that in socialist nations like Cuba, where they, don't have the ability to make newer things like that. But anyway, when it comes to this, think of capitalism as sort of an off-road vehicle like a Jeep or a truck that has shock absorbers and all that. It can handle rough terrain. A sedan, it works pretty good on the road, but really if any obstacle bigger than a speed bump comes its way, it can't handle it. It starts breaking to pieces because the thing doesn't adjust well. An off-road vehicle, that ride's going to be bumpy. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to like it. You're going to definitely notice if you're going over some really big hills or some really big dunes. But the point is you're going to be able to get through it. A sedan can't. It just stalls out. That's really the big difference between socialism and capitalism. You see, capitalism isn't supposed to solve all of the world's problems. It's supposed to allow people to use their dollars to allocate resources more efficiently and make them go where they want them to go. And in that way, it does it far better than socialism. Let's go to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
We are living in a time where there is a lot of stupid to go around, and part of the reason for that stupid is something I alluded to earlier in the program, that when people are panicked or freaked out or afraid, they tend to make decisions in haste, and those decisions tend to not be good decisions. Today is the latest installment of that. There is a bill in the Senate right now that would do a number of things, but among them, and this may be the dumbest thing out of all of them, is they are contemplating sending a $1,000 check to everybody. Now, I have intense sympathy for people that are incapable of working right now and are having to rely on friends and family and neighbors to help them out in this. But the idea that we need to send unilaterally every single person a check, granted, I do like that plan better than giving it to specific people, because then only the people that wind up with it are people that don't need to get it. But this is basically a giant redistribution of wealth scheme that the Democrats have been pushing for a while. Andrew Yang, who is running for the president and trying to get the Democrat nomination recently, came up with a similar plan, even though his was actually a lot more logical than the one that is being proposed right now. So this bill is being floated by the White House, and they are considering even supporting this. And it was promoted by Mitt Romney, who has never met a spending measure he doesn't like. That was one of the big problems with Mitt Romney. He was running against Barack Obama. It was really difficult for him to run against him, considering he wanted to pretty much spend as much money as Barack Obama did. And that was something that was very difficult for him to do. But the stimulus has never worked. And they're talking about spending about $1 trillion on the stimulus here. Can anybody name a government stimulus that actually did what it was supposed to do? Because you look all the way back to the New Deal with FDR, all the way up to the Obama stimulus packages, both of which were massive busts and wasted tons of taxpayer money and did not help the economy. We didn't start pulling out of the economy until the last years, really about the last year and a half of the Obama presidency. Those stimulus packages both came within a year and a half of him taking office. And so the stimulus packages had nothing to do with the economic recovery. And they have never worked at any point. And by the way, the first stimulus package that President Barack Obama put out was about the same amount as the stimulus package that is being proposed right now. This is a very, very dumb idea. Because currently, there are 254 million adult citizens. Now, doing simple math, you can calculate that if every single one received a $1,000 check, that would mean that we would be spending $254 billion to be able to pull that off. Now, remember that we are currently already operating at a $1 trillion deficit, meaning we spend about $1 trillion more than we take in from tax revenue. And we only bring in about $3.8 trillion, which is a mind-boggling number, but that's not nearly enough to cover our annual budget, which sits at roughly $5 trillion. And so, considering we bring in $3.8 trillion, 3.8, closer to 3.9, we're not sure, it depends on where your projections are and which one that you believe from the Congressional Budget Office of what we are projected to bring in. But anyway, it's roughly 3.8 trillion. Either way, that means that the $254 billion we would have to spend on this would be roughly 1/16 of all of the tax revenue that we bring in. All of it. That is an insane amount of money. Now, granted, like I said on the onset, I do like the idea of getting it back to the citizens more than it being distributed by the government deciding who gets it and who doesn't. But also remember that a large percentage of the American population, even the adults, do not pay taxes, which means that a whole bunch of people would be getting money even though they did not put money into the system itself. So this one-time spending measure would cost 1/16 of all of the revenue that we bring in for an entire year, and it would happen in one day. That is an unsustainable plan for a number of reasons. Because ultimately you have to ask the question, just like you do in every government program, where is this money coming from? And there are only three possible answers. One, it's coming from taxes. But if we're going to be bringing in the amount of money that we're projected to bring in, that doesn't look good. Considering that we would be spending 1/16 of our entire revenue in a single day, and also increasing the amount of taxes that we have, because this would put us even further over budget. That's a really, really dumb idea at a time where businesses are going to be suffering anyway. At a time where people are going to have issues going out and spending money anyway. So all that would do is actually hurt the economy, not bolster it. The other source it could come from is China. Do you really think China is going to be in favor of giving us another loan right now? I mean, maybe they do. But A, do we really want to have to pay that back later? And B, do you really think China, who is being hit the hardest by the coronavirus and is still trying to recover from this, thankfully they are, it seems as though, at least right now, they are over the hump and starting to do a little bit better. Do you really think China believes themselves to be in a position to offer another loan of this magnitude to the United States? Because I tend to think that they probably are going to be pretty hesitant to do that. That's going to be a real hard sell to the Chinese people. Granted, I think they should just give the money to us because they started this whole thing in the first place. But nonetheless, you know what I'm saying. That was a joke. I'm not actually advocating that. But when it comes to this, the idea that China is going to be super willing and chomping at the bit to give us a loan seems incredibly dubious to me. And frankly, I don't want to have to pay this thing off later anyway, as much debt as we already are into them. And then the third place it could come from is we print money, which has a number of unforeseen consequences, but the ones I'm more worried about are the foreseen consequences. If we have another quantitative easing where the federal government just starts printing money like crazy to be able to send all these checks out to people, what do you think that's going to do to the value of the dollar? See, what they're doing is they're stealthily taxing the people that have savings because it devalues the dollars that you already have. This is just another form of redistribution of wealth. The way that it's doing is the people that are prepared, the people that actually do have a nest egg, the people that actually do have money in the banks and did do things the right way and did prepare for an eventuality like this, are going to be robbed to help the people who did not prepare. Now, as somebody who did do a decent amount of preparation, I wouldn't say that I'm super prepared for this. I don't know that anybody was super prepared for this. If somebody came to my door and needed food or needed something to help them out, I do the absolute best that I can to help them. But I don't like the government taking things from me and stealing from the people who saved through inflation to be able to provide a program for the people who did not save. If you remember the parable, the story, however you want to say it, of the grasshopper and the ant, it would be like the government taking food from the ant's mouth to give it to the grasshopper who goofed around all summer and didn't do any work and didn't gather food. That's effectively what would be happening here. You see, the thing is, this is not going to really help people with the coronavirus because they're going to spend it on whatever. It's amazing to me, and I know that this is anecdotal evidence, but stay with me on this. Every single person that I've talked to about this, every single one, every time they come up with something that they're going to spend it on, it has nothing to do with the coronavirus or preparing for it. It has nothing to do with groceries or essentials for their families. I had one person suggest that they were going to use the money if they got it on things for their house, like new baseboards and new windows or something to that effect. Another person actually suggested that they were going to use it to buy a whole bunch of video games to keep them entertained during this thing, which I understand wanting to be entertained. That's part of the reason I'm doing the show during the coronavirus quarantine. But first of all, you have tactics for free, so I don't know why you would want to do that. But nonetheless, if you're going to do that, you're just buying things that you don't need, non-essentials with the government money. Now, again, I know that that's just anecdotal evidence and that's secondary to my primary argument that I just made. But the point is, people are not going to use this for that kind of thing by and large. They're going to use it for whatever it is that they need to spend money on at the time. And so I do not see how this winds up helping in any way, and not to be outdone by all the stupidity surrounding her. AOC, of course, had to fire off something ignorantly about this because she was also floating this and other policy proposals. So this was AOC's reaction, and I love this one. She says, "This is unacceptable. Trump is using this public health crisis as an opportunity to push tax cuts and corporate bailouts. This is an emergency. We need to help vulnerable people and small businesses now with paid leave, extended unemployment, UBI, Medicaid expansion, and mortgage suspensions." Now, does anybody catch the hilarity going on in that tweet? That she starts complaining that Donald Trump is doing things like cutting taxes and giving money to businesses. By the way, that one I do not agree with, and I think actually is a bad idea. I just explained how stimulus packages never work out the way that they're supposed to. But in AOC's rage over this and anger over this, at how dare President Trump ever use this crisis to push his personal policy proposals. And then she goes right into proposing how we should use this crisis to push all the things that she has been pushing for a really long time, like a universal basic income or Medicaid expansion, that kind of thing. So it's just hilarious to me that AOC is so completely devoid of all self-awareness that she can, in the same tweet that she's complaining about Donald Trump using the crisis to promote his personal policy agenda, that she does exactly the same thing. I mean, it is just hysterical that she is so devoid of all self-awareness. It's like she can't even sense it. Ultimately, what this comes down to, though, I understand the government acting in some ways, and for somebody that's very libertarian-leaning like myself, that is a big step that's not exactly easy for me to take. But on situations like this, where we're in an emergency situation, I understand the government taking steps, and even taking big steps, to try to curtail it. I totally am on board with spending a significant amount of money on the CDC to try to make sure that we have the testing kits out. We try to expedite government work as quickly as we can to get things like vaccines tested. I understand increasing money in research and all of those things. And to a degree, even though I disagree with unemployment benefits as a whole, I even understand the rationale of extending it past the point where somebody, because right now they wouldn't really be able to find work considering there's going to be virtually nobody hiring. Even though I disagree with unemployment on the whole, I kind of at least understand the logic in that one specifically. But all these other things that are just policy dreams of the Democrats, that they're basically trying to go through their checklist of all the things they've been advocating for years, and using this crisis as a way to do that, it's sickening, it's slimy, and ultimately it doesn't do anything to combat the coronavirus. I don't understand the idea that we allow Democrats to hold this crisis over our heads as leverage and try to use it to get all of their policy proposals that they've been doing for years through. And I hope the Republicans at some point grow a spine and say, no, enough is enough. Let's pass a clean bill that only deals directly with things dealing with the coronavirus. Unfortunately, I'm not going to hold my breath on them doing that. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today. I think that there are an awful lot of people that are really genuinely spiritually wondering why all this is happening, why is it happening now? And those questions are not unfounded. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking some of those questions, but I think that there are a lot of wrong answers and misinformation out there, or at least uninformed people that are making claims that they cannot back up. One that I have seen is that this is a direct punishment coming from God. Now, as a full disclaimer, I'm always incredibly cautious when determining that anything is divine providence or a direct act of God's will. Now, when it comes to terrible things happening to countries, my normal response is not that God is going out of his way to directly take them down, but more that he is removing his hand of protection. And so it's more like he was sustaining a nation and just isn't for a time, rather than him actually going out and destroying people. And I think from a spiritual nature, and we're not going to dive way off into this, I think that that's kind of how punishment works with him in general. For example, when they say, how could a loving God send anybody to hell? I don't know that he actually sends people to hell as much as he just allows them to reap the benefits that they have sown. In other words, they live an immoral life, and because of that, they stay with other people who have done the same. And if you have a place that is populated only with evil people, well, then that place is going to be hell, whether it's on this side of eternity or the next. And so it's not so much that God goes out of his way and just smacks somebody as much as it is he takes away his blessing and his protection from them. Normally, I think that's how it spiritually works. And a lot of this comes from, a lot of my understanding was really sort of shaped by a passage in the book of Lamentations. Now, to understand what's going on in the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah, who authored the book, he's not called the weeping prophet for nothing. Jeremiah has spent a large portion of his life doing all kinds of things, trying to get Israel's attention and telling them, hey guys, just so you know, the day of judgment is coming. It is on its way. And if you don't repent and turn from your ways right now, it's going to get really, really bad. And he said this for years on end, and Israel still ignored him. He did everything that he could, even making his own life sort of a parable for Israel to help understand the seriousness of their rebellion against God. And ultimately, They refuse to repent, and because of this, the book of Lamentation is a reaction to Israel's refusal to repent. And so we're going to go ahead and look in Lamentation chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And remember, this is sort of a poetic book, and so this is written in poetic verse. So Lamentations 2, 1 through 3. How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. He has cast from heaven to earth the glory of Israel, and has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord swallowed up, he has not spared, all the habitations of Jacob. In his wrath has he thrown down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought them down to the ground. He has profaned the kingdom and its princes. In the fiercest anger, he has cut off all strength of Israel. He has drawn back his right hand from before the enemy, and he has burned in Jacob like a flaming fire, consuming all around him. Now, when you're looking at that passage of Scripture, there are actually several things that I wanted you to bring up, to sort of bring to your attention. 3 things in particular. You'll notice how the action taken from God is not actively against Israel. It's more like he has been holding the enemy at bay, and then all of a sudden he has decided, nope, not going to do that anymore, just going to let them do what they were going to do already. And so in that sense, God is more of a protector that leaves his post rather than a punisher or an avenger. I think that sometimes the Bible paints him in that language too, and that's wholly appropriate. But I'm saying this is one instance where it kind of talks about God doing the opposite. So 3 things I want you to notice. In verse 1, it says that he has not remembered his footstool, and just so you know, Jerusalem is often referred to as the footstool of God. So that's symbolism they would have readily understood. So he's going to not remember them. And then you skip down to verse 3, he says he's going to cut off the strength of Israel. So that's the second instance where it's sort of God removing himself from the situation. And the third, he has drawn back his right hand. So in each of these scenarios, God is active. He is making a choice and making a decision, but that choice is not to actively punish Israel, but just to not protect them the way that he has been in the past. And I think in a lot of ways, this is reflective of Christ's ministry and how he explains it. If you look at his parables, for example, the parable of the lamb, did the shepherd kick the lamb out, or did the lamb leave of his own accord? That lost lamb was not banished by the shepherd. The lamb decided to pursue after something that he shouldn't have and go a place where he ought not go. And then the shepherd, of course, eventually does bring him back, but ultimately it was not the shepherd who drove the lamb out of the herd. The lamb left of his own accord. The same could be said of the lost son. When you're talking about the prodigal son, you see that son had gone and then came back. The father didn't make the son leave. The son left because he wanted to leave and he wanted his inheritance and to live a riotous, evil lifestyle. And then when it came to the rich fool, you remember the one that said, okay, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns and I'll have an even greater harvest and increase my wealth. And then God says to him, you fool, this night your soul shall be required of you. Again, this is something that it seems to be emphasizing the fact that he did all this to himself. He fell prey to his own action, not something that God was doing proactively to him. And they all center around this central idea that it is God's protection that is being removed, not so much that God is actively punishing those people. You could see this in other places, for example, the wedding feast or the parable of the 10 virgins. It's not as though the people that come to the wedding feast or the virgins that come to the door, he doesn't kick them out of the wedding feast or the wedding banquet. They're just already outside and he does not let them in. There is a big difference there. Ultimately, what this means for us is we can either recognize our dependency on God or be forced to recognize it. We either can repent of our sins and choose to turn away from our evil ways, or we can have this divine protection taken away from us and realize how much we needed him. It's in a lot of ways kind of like a parent. You know, because when you're a kid, you think you know everything. When you're a kid, you say to your parents, no, I don't need your help. I have this. I can do it. I can do it on my own. I don't know how many times as a child I said, I can do it on my own when I got in way over my head. And for a while, the parent will protest. The parent will say, no, you don't. Let me help you out. Whether you're learning to ride a bike or do something that might hurt you, they may step in and go, no, I'm gonna, have my hand here on the back of the bike. I'm going to help you along here. And then eventually, if you keep protesting and say, no, I've got it. I don't need your help. I'll be okay. Eventually, a good parent is going to say, okay, go ahead. And sometimes as a kid, you learn a hard lesson that way. Whether you wind up smashing into something on your bike because you weren't ready or whatever else it may be, the parent is stepping in because they understand that the child can't do this on their own, and the child defiantly says, no, I don't need your help. I have this. How many times do we in this country do that to God? Whether we do it directly or indirectly, we're like, you know what, God, we don't really need your help. We don't really need to pray for this stuff. We don't really need your blessings upon us. Look at all the amazing things we've got. Now, you just heard earlier in this program that capitalism has done so much for this country. But ultimately, the only reason that it works is because we acknowledged God's presence and his working in it. I mean, that's the that's the key ingredient of this whole thing. If that goes away, everything else goes away. The reason that freedom functions at all is because people are self-governing and have a relationship with God. John Adams stated that. Somebody that was there during the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence being forged. I mean, he understood that. And our other president said similar things to him and understood that as well. That our society and our Constitution and our laws and our system were all designed for a moral, religious people that took their relationship with God seriously. And once that went away, once that was no longer preeminent, well, then the system started to develop some problems. And that's what we're seeing right now. I don't want to be forced to recognize our dependency on God. I want to, and I'm humble enough to realize I may not fully appreciate it. But I really, really want to not have to go through that. I would really rather just be grateful and recognize God's dependency on me now before I have to be taught that lesson through a very unpleasant means. But this is what happened to the British Empire in the Revolutionary War. It happened to us during the Civil War. It happened to us in World War II. It really happened to the world in World War II, where God kind of withdrew his protection and let some really horrible things happen because we had forsaken him. And it could happen again. You know how much I love this country. A big part of the reason I do this show is because of my patriotism, because I love this country. I think that it is an exceptional place. I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe this is the greatest, most prosperous nation that has ever existed on the face of this planet. But you know what? America is not too big to fail in God's eyes. If America is destroyed, the world will go on. It survived a long time before us. It'll survive afterward. And when it comes to God, I'm not saying that the coronavirus is this, and I don't think that this is going to be the result of this, but I'm just saying, whether it's this or something else, there is no nation that is built by human hands that cannot be defeated by God. Period. End of discussion. People would have said that there was no way the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire or the British Empire would have ever fallen prey like other nations have. You could do that all the way back to Egypt, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, any of them. And they're all just pages in our history books now. There is no nation that once God has decided not to protect them anymore, that will not fall without his blessing. That's just the truth. And so we better make sure that we do everything we can to do what Abraham Lincoln suggested, and make sure that we are on God's side instead of worrying whether or not God's on our side, because God's side is always the right side. And so we need to be worried about that more than we're worried about everything else. I worry about the economy. I worry about everything else too. But ultimately, if we don't do that right, if we screw that up, if we don't keep the covenant with God that we have made, then it doesn't matter how strong our economy is. It doesn't matter how impervious we seem to be to the outside world. America will fall. There is no nation made by human hands that God cannot take down if he removes his protection from them. That has always been true. It is always going to be true. No nation beforehand or in the future will ever exist that that rule does not apply to. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by